To start, with perhaps many of us have likely asked at one point in our lives. As our theme today goes, the question, Panginoon, saan po ba? For many young people today, these questions feels very real. It may arise during moments of our confusion, pain, or maybe failure or uncertainty. Sometimes it whispers in silence before falling asleep. Other times, it lingers behind our dreams, our fears, our ambitions, and even tears. And honestly, that was also my question before. Today I would like to share my personal journey as a religious sister, not because my story is extraordinary or dramatic, but because God works beautifully through ordinary lives, and in this case, in my life. My name is Sister Jeanette Formentera, a perpetually professed sister of the Daughters of Saint Francis de Sales. As I reflect on my vocation story, I realize that God calls began long before I entered the convent. It started at home. I grew up in a simple Catholic family where faith was not only taught but also lived. My father worked overseas as an OFW to support us, while my mother lovingly took care of our home. Along with my grandmother and my four siblings, our household became a place where prayer was a natural part of our life. We were trained to pray at a very young age. From an early age in grade school, we learned already to pray rosary, novenas, and traditional Catholic prayers. That's how our grandmother taught us and molded us. At that time, I didn't understand theology or even my vocation. I only knew that every evening we gathered to pray, beginning with the 6 o'clock prayer, the Angelus. Looking back now, I realize that those simple family prayers were already shaping my heart. Some people believe that a vocation starts with a dramatic sign from heaven, but often God speaks to us quietly. He calls us through our parents, through our family, and those people guiding us. And the ordinary moments we often overlook. Looking back, God was already whispering, Jeanette, follow me. But at that time, I was still asking, Panginoon, saan po ba? As I grew older, I became actively involved in youth ministry. I am also part of the parish youth ministry in our parish. I attended youth gatherings, parish activities, and church programs. Through these experiences, I discovered a different kind of joy, the joy of serving. I learned that happiness is deeper when life is shared with others. Later on, I also involved in our barangay As one brother, if I'm not mistaken, he was an SK officer before. I was also before an SK counselor in our barangay. Through the leadership role and community service, I learned the value of responsibility, dedication, and compassion for others. At that time, I honestly believed that my future would revolve around my career, leadership positions, and community work. However, deep inside, I felt a quiet restlessness. Everything seems okay, yet my heart still searches for something more. That was me. Even while serving in our community or in the church, even while being active, there remained a silent question in my heart. Panginoon, saan po ba? And sometimes vocation begins exactly there in holy restlessness. At the age of 19, God's invitation became clearer to me. It did not come through visions or miracles or dramatic revelations, but rather through prayer, reflection, and personal encounter and the people God placed in my life. There was a quiet but persistent voice in my heart urging to consider a religious life. And honestly, I struggled with this call. Vocation is beautiful, yes, but it is also a costly commitment. And I asked myself, kaya ko ba? What about my dreams? What about my family? What if I fail? What if this is not really for me? There were moments of fear and uncertainty. Perhaps some of you are currently experiencing this as well. It may not necessarily be related to religious life, but rather concerning your future, direction, or purpose. Often, we want God to reveal the entire plan before we take the first step. But it's not always the case. However, that's not how vocation works. God typically unveils His will upon one step at a time. Throughout this process, I learned an important lesson. Clarity does not always come first. That's why don't worry if the future isn't clear. Trust comes first. The more I surrendered my fears to God, the more I found peace. Not comfort or certainty, but peace. And that peace became my confirmation. Eventually, I entered religious life and became part of the Daughters of Saint Francis de Sales. However, entering the convent did not mean that all my struggles disappeared. In fact, religious comes with its own sacrifices, like any other vocation. Sacrifices is always coupled. There are moments of homesickness, times of misunderstandings, periods of exhaustion, and times when you question yourself. There are days when ministry becomes challenging, days when prayer feels dry, and days when you feel weak and inadequate. it's important to remember that religious sisters are not angels. We are human too, continually learning how to love God faithfully. Despite the struggles, I have also discovered a profound joy, the joy that the world cannot easily explain. There is the joy of belonging completely to God, the joy of serving others, the joy of accompanying people on their journeys, the joy of helping young people discern their purpose, and the joy of witnessing lives transformed by God's love. And slowly my question before, Panginoon, saan po ba? Became, Panginoon, salamat po, dito pala. One of the greatest blessings in my vocation is discovering the spirituality of our very own patron saint, Saint Francis de Sales. He teaches us, and it was been mentioned many times before me with the two speakers, that holiness is possible in every state of life. And this is our first calling. Holiness is not reserved only for priests and religious. We can become holy as a student, as a parent, as a professional, as a youth leader, as a teacher, as a simple person trying to love God daily. He also teaches gentleness, humility, patience, and trust in God's loving will. And one lesson that deeply touched me from our patron saint is that bloom where God planted you. Meaning, vocation is not about becoming someone else. When we think, I wanted to become popular and I will enter seminary or religious life, it's not. Because vocation is about becoming fully the person God entrusted you to be, or God created you to be. To those who are still asking right now, Panginoon, saan po ba? Allow me to share a few lessons from my personal journey. First, do not be afraid of silence. Many of our young people of today are very afraid of silence. God often speaks softly. We know that the world is noisy. Social media, pressures, expectations, and distractions. However, vocation is usually heard in silence. That is why three things are very important. Pray, reflect, and listen. Second lesson, God's call is personal. Your call is not her call or his call. My call is not your call. Do not compare your journey to others. Some people discover their vocation early, while others find theirs later. Some are called to marriage, others to the priesthood or religious life, and some to single life and service. What truly matters is not the title of your vocation, but your faithfulness to God's call. Life is not easy. For the third lesson, peace is one of God's sign. It is not free from problems. However, there is deep peace even in sacrifice. There is peace when we are where God wants us to be. The fourth lesson, trust God's timing. Maybe your time is not right now, maybe later or some other day, or perhaps it will take years. Sometimes we seek immediate answers, but as what we have heard also a while ago, that discernment is a journey. It's not a why it's not a one night dream that tomorrow, okay, it is already what I discern. This is a process, a journey. God shapes us with patience. That's why this virtue is very essential. Remember, God never tires of calling us back. We may grow weary of returning, but God never grows tired of waiting. Courage for the fifth lesson. Say yes, even if you are afraid. Courage does not mean the absence of fear. Instead, courage is about trusting God even in the presence of fear. That's why don't be afraid. Fear is very natural. Reflecting my own life, I see that every experience, my family, my background, youth ministry, community service, my struggles, uncertainties and prayers, all of those things contributed to God's beautiful plan for me. Even now, my vocation feels like a journey. Each day, God continues to ask me, will you keep following me? And each day, I strive to respond, yes, Lord. To all the young people here today, if your heart is asking, Lord, where should I go? Do not be afraid of that question. Sometimes, just asking the question is the first step toward discovering your vocation. Perhaps one day, you will look back and realize that God has been guiding you all along. Because as I realized that was also my journey before, today, and in the future. God, I believe that God is always guiding me. For that note, thank you, and may God bless us all.